Good evening, everyone. I'm so excited that you're going to be with us for a webinar tonight. It's a very important topic as we start to head back to school in the fall time. The webinar tonight is alternate education options for gifted children during a pandemic and beyond. My name is Tracy Inman, and I am the parent representative for the National Association for Gifted Children. Just a couple of housekeeping things before I introduce you to our esteemed guest tonight. And one is that you actually have control over how your screen looks. If you've never done Zoom before, the top right corner, you can play around with speaker view or panel view if you just want to make something bigger, just an FYI there. The second thing is we have two features that are down at the bottom. One is called chat. And we really do want to hear from you. So I hope that you will utilize chat to introduce yourselves, to share ideas, resources, that sorts of thing. Later on in the presentation, we are going to take time for questions and answers. So please, if you have any questions at all, put them in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen. Now I'm going to take the time to introduce to you our very experienced and very expert folks who are going to be sharing time with us tonight. The first is Dr. Ellen Honeck. And Ellen is a program manager for the Gifted and Talented Department of Denver Public Schools. She's been involved with gifted education in public and private settings as a classroom teacher, administrator, gifted specialist, curriculum developer, consultant, author, and adjunct professor. Talk about lots of experience there, folks. She is also on the board of directors with me, and she was the recipient of the 2016 NAGC President's Award. Next is Dr. Jessica Kohler, and she is the author of Beyond School Walls at Psychology Today. And there she focuses on bringing the science of psychology to learning and life. Dr. Kohler is also the co-principal investigator of a research project focused on gifted learners' social, emotional, and behavioral characteristics. In addition, she's a homeschooling parent of two exceptional boys. Our second Dr. Jessica, and this is Dr. Jessica LaFollette, she's the mother of 4 girls, and she's been teaching gifted children in Kansas City for 19 years in both public and private school settings. She earned her Ph.D. from the University of Kansas, Missouri, and her research interests include the effects of varying state-level gifted policies and culturally responsive curriculum for diverse gifted students. She is president-elect of the Kansas Association for Gifted, Talented, and Creative. I told you we've got all kinds of expertise here. So be thinking of the questions you want, jot them in that Q&A, and Ellen, I'm gonna pass this over to you now.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm excited to be here. So I'm going to kind of frame the day and talk about the reality and where we are in different programming options. So the reality is that remote learning started in the spring of 2019. It was not planned. We are all in this, and schools had to shift and change like never before in their entire existence. And what we need to recognize is that what happened in the spring is not necessarily the programming that's happening now in the fall. And depending on where you're at and which state you're at, the varying programming options are really going to change. So we are still in this position because we're looking at COVID cases rising on a daily basis. So we're still continuing on 30 to 50,000, depending on the news reports that you're reading, continue to rise. When you're looking at school options, right now there is no federal or state level guidance. Some states are starting to provide some guidance for schools and others are not. And so again, depending on your school and your location and where you're at. The American Academy of Pediatrics guidance says, if you follow certain guidelines, then you are welcome to go back to school. And we encourage you to go back to school. I don't know any educator in any school that doesn't want to be in a school. However, we have to recognize that we are looking at 6 principles around social distancing, around wearing masks, around healthy policies. And so the AAP strongly advocates that all policy considerations should start with the goal of having students physically present. And then there's the health considerations that go on that. Because there is no federal or state level guidance, schools are left to work with their own individual health departments. Because they're left working with their own health departments, there are a variety of different health departments within a metro area. So I'm in Denver, Colorado, and we have in the metropolitan Denver area, there's at least 5 different health departments that different school districts are required to follow guidance for. Not every health department has the same guidance, because depending on your county or your area and your area within the health, the guidelines are different and the cases of COVID are different. Plans for schools have to be approved by local health departments. Guidance continues to change because organizations will then make statements, health department changes, the COVID cases change. And so the level of planning that schools have been doing, while it feels like everything is last minute and there's nothing, it's because things have been changing on a daily, almost hourly basis, depending on what's been going on. So please know, as a public school employee, it's important to recognize that we think we have a plan, we're ready, we make an announcement, and then literally within 2 or 3 hours, sometimes the health department will come out with a statement, or the national level organizations come out with a statement. And so while I understand the frustration as a parent, please know that school employees are equally as frustrated trying to figure everything out. We're going into the unknown. Everybody's confused about the options and uncertainty the school year brings. Teachers would prefer to be back in a classroom with their students face-to-face if that's how they've been teaching. If they've been teaching online, then thankfully for them, it doesn't impact them at all. The other thing is that we don't want a repeat of the spring. So some schools in the spring, when everything happened, they just kind of threw their hands up and they said, well, we finished 3rd quarter, so as long as you have a grade for 3rd quarter, nothing, 4th quarter isn't gonna be detrimental to where you're at. So it's literally trying to figure out, okay, this is where we're at and this is what's gonna happen. And so as a child, and I'm sure many of you know these type of children, when you get the information that, well, my grade can't go down for 4th quarter, so my final grade for the semester is gonna be whatever my 3rd quarter grade is, then you have a wide range of people and students in terms of participation and looking at whether or not they are going to, in fact, participate in school. And then also everyone is concerned about health and the varying intricacies of individual cases and individual family situations as well. So there's a lot of typical educational options. So in person, and again, thinking about back in January even, to think that this would be kind of common knowledge and common terminology that we're starting to hear, brick and mortar is basically just literally meaning the school building itself. And that was generally just a term that was used in online education and now has become mainstream because now we're in remote settings. So you have typical educational options where students are in the school full-time on a day-to-day basis. You have a hybrid or blended learning option, which is some sort of combination of an in-person and an online program. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what the online programs can look like, but hybrid means you're in person sometimes, or blended in person sometimes and online sometimes. And then there's the homeschooling option. And again, we're going to, Dr. Jessica Kohler will talk a little bit more about homeschooling more specifically, but homeschooling really varies depending on your state that you're in. And so when you're looking at that, again, it's just really varied in terms of what that looks like. When you're looking at online options, there's several different types of online options. There are full-time public schools, and there are full-time public, and there's full-time private K-12 schools. And so when you're looking at those options, it's interesting because obviously a private school has tuition and a public K-12 online school would be not tuition based. keeping that in mind, different states have different rules about what constitutes and whether or not you can participate in a full-time online school. So if you're looking at a full-time school for an online program, you want to look for accreditation, you want to look for schedule flexibility, you want to look at whether or not the program is offering advanced courses such as AP, if those classes can then transfer into like the University of California system. You need to look at whether the instruction is synchronous or asynchronous. So is it live in person and you have to log in at a certain time? Or is it that you can watch a video or do it whenever you want to? So if you're a nighttime person and you prefer to do your learning at 1 in the morning, you can do that. Or do you have to log in at 9 a.m. in the morning and be live? What kinds of interactions do the programs offer with teachers? Is there a teacher that they're getting student interaction? Is it one-on-one interaction, or is it through email? Is it through chat? Are there counselors? Are there mentorship opportunities? Also looking at the work, is it self-directed and independent? And can your child work at the speed? Can they work as fast as they want, or can they work as slow as they want? Again, keeping that in mind. A fallacy that people think about online programs is that there's no social emotional interaction. And I can guarantee that that is not the case. Depending on what kind of program you're looking for, there's all sorts of different options with online schools around clubs, around organizations, around different elements related to social interactions. And so oftentimes students are in more clubs and involved in more activities with an online school than they are sometimes even in a regular school during the regular school day. There's personalized learning programs, and so those are online options, but those are content specific oftentimes. So you subscribe to a Redbird type program where you're getting curriculum for math, and then it's an online math program, but it's not necessarily your whole entire school day. And so keeping that in mind as you're looking at programs, are you looking for personalized programs where there's different elements along the way? It could be a specific course that runs several times. It might be looking at different elements along the way, and that's kind of that personalized program. So all of my math content or language arts course or an AP class, depending on what's going on. Also then looking at enrichment classes, and enrichment classes right now with everybody moving remote in the spring, there's a lot more offerings in terms of enrichment classes. So these can be from the Centers for Talent Development, Duke TIP, Northwestern, Johns Hopkins, CTD, or Center for Bright Kids. So depending on your region, there's lots of options around the talent development type programs. There's also specific honors classes or topical classes. So an enrichment class, it might meet one time, it might meet like 3 or 4 different times throughout a month, it might meet just a semester. So again, it's really looking at that. And then I do want to highlight that remote learning, again, remote learning that happened in the spring was not true online learning, because basically what happened was remote learning, everybody quickly adapted to a remote environment and went, oh, what I'm doing regularly in my class now has to be adapted for an online environment. And a true online environment is where the materials and curriculum and classes and activities are designed to be enhanced through technology. We also have a lot of emerging options due to the pandemic. So more recently, you've heard a lot about pandemic pods, and I know that Dr. Jessica Lafayette will be talking about the learning pods and thinking about equity issues related to those. Micro schools are similar, and again, learning pods or the pandemic pods are really when parents are creating an alternate instruction. So it's similar to a co-op or a one-room schoolhouse kind of function. Micro schools are similar in that way, but generally with a micro school, the structure of the school is where a group of parents or a group of individuals hire a teacher to go ahead and take that. And then right now there is a ton of tutoring companies to make sure that students are getting what they need. And so again, tutors can be hired specifically for various elements for, you know, a specific math tutor, or a tutor can be used, tutoring companies are advertising to be used to help their students help your student get math or their curriculum completed, and just kind of be that teacher more one-on-one. The interesting thing about all of these additional options right now is to really make sure that we're looking at working with your state department. Every state is so different, and figuring out what's going to work for you and your family along the lines of what is going to work in terms of your setting and where you're at and who you are. As you're weighing your options, it's really important to think about your curriculum. As you're looking at your options, do you want to design the curriculum as a family, or do you want others to design the curriculum? When you're thinking about your child, do you want them to be outside of the home, or do you want them to be inside the home? And then also thinking about synchronous interactions versus asynchronous interactions. Do they thrive on the interaction of being with individuals? Do they thrive on that interaction? Are they not a morning person, and so all of their school is normally done in morning, but yet they would rather do all of their learning in the evening? Or are they really an early morning person, in which case then those asynchronous interactions are going to be better? And then you have to really think of your child and your family. So as you're considering the multitude of options that are out there for educational programming, it's important to go ahead and think of your child. What kind of strengths do they have? What kind of challenges? What's their learning profile? How does that look? So if your child is not a self-directed learner on a computer and gets distracted easily, online learning is probably not your best option. If they love to dive in and focus specifically, then online learning might be your best way to go. Think about the academic needs. Is the school that you're currently enrolled in able to meet their needs? How about the content level? Are they able to be challenged? Do they have enough extracurriculars? Are you doing things outside of the school day that take up all of their time? If you're really into an athletic or music program, then again, an online option with that flexibility to do the training might be a great option. Thinking about your social emotional needs, and really thinking in terms of that social emotional needs and how that's going to look in terms of your child. Do they thrive on that daily interaction with peers, the non-screen based interactions? Again, we can have great relationships on the screen, and for those of us that thrive on that interpersonal connection, sometimes the screen isn't enough. And then what other professional support is available? Sometimes online schools have additional IEP, social workers, psychologists, resource teachers. Sometimes they don't. Again, you'll have to look at your specific setting, your specific state. Also, you can log, depending on the school that you enroll in, you may be able to access some of the public school options. It's really, those additional public school supports, again, it's really dependent on the state that you're in. And then keeping in mind that as you're thinking about options, and I know it feels really stressful right now, trying to figure out what to do in the fall, what to do in a week. Schools are changing, they're constantly changing their minds, they're doing all sorts of different things. You're not alone. Everybody's in the same place, and educators are equally as frustrated. And then also in thinking of your circumstance and thinking about every circumstance is unique. You know your family, you know who they are, you know their medical conditions. You have to make your best decision, and you have to leverage additional resources. Just because they're doing a remote option or an online option this year, or schools going part-time or hybrid, doesn't mean you can't leverage additional options. Just like you would extend to outside of school extracurricular activities, you can do the same thing now. And schools and districts are working really hard, and I know that it's frustrating for parents. And I, as a parent, am equally as frustrated. And I assure you that for the school district employees that are trying to figure the options out, it's equally as frustrating when you spend all your time working on one option and another option comes up. So exercise patience and grace as much as possible. And I am going to turn it over now to Dr. Kohler.
Thank you so much for that. That was such wonderful information, Dr. Honeck. And thank you, Tracy, for the great introduction. I come to homeschooling very accidentally. I was previously a public school psychologist. So my husband and I went to public school, and we had always assumed that our children would also attend public school, but we kind of ended up having two boys who didn't really fit well into the typical educational options. And so we kind of lucked into figuring out a homeschooling path that seems to really be working for us. And I'm very grateful for that. Thank you. As a psychologist, I started off thinking about how could I approach homeschooling with the knowledge I have from psychology and psychology. I've taught about all different fields within psychology, and I really came to understand how important something was that I learned about way back in early part of maybe even undergrad. This whole concept of goodness of fit is so important. You know, this is like a theory that from the 1970s about how important it is to match the needs of the individual child and individual child's temperament with the environment. And I can just tell you that that is the most critical component of creating a homeschooling environment, that compatibility of temperament with environment. And so when parents often come to me, we've been homeschooling now for like 5 years, they come to me and they're like, what do I do? How do I homeschool? And my first response is, well, it depends. It depends on who you are. It depends on what your background is. It depends on what your child is like or what your children are like. And they could be very different, and trying to match the environment to their particular needs. And that's one of the most wonderful things about being able to homeschool, is that you can try to match the environment to the individual needs. And with gifted children, this can be really, really beneficial to be able to meet the needs of the very diverse learners that you might have. And, you know, really, really focusing on that interaction between temperament and environment. And in terms of homeschooling, it's really one of the things that I know is very tempting to do, and I've fallen into so many traps, and I'll share some of them with you, is try to replicate what other people are doing, right? But so you want to look and say, wow, that's working so well for your family. Can I just, you know, keep telling more about it? And of course, getting more information is great, but really, you know, piggybacking on what Ellen was saying, you have to figure out what's going to work for your own family and your own individual children. And I can tell you that creating a good fit is one of the most critical things you can do, you know, as we're being thrown into this, you know, remote learning, and some of you might be taking on homeschooling for the first time. Creating that good fit will really enhance that parent-child attachment, which is more important than anything, really. Great attachment is, you know, parent-child attachment is so critical and related to so many variables, you know, long-term variables in terms of ending up being a healthy, happy adult. So that's something you really want to keep in mind, that the focus should be on really making sure that you're creating a good fit to create a good environment and sustain healthy attachment. Next. So again, I kind of like to think about this, what is the ultimate goal of creating this sort of environment? It's that synchronization between the environment and the individual child's needs. And I'm going to talk a lot about, we have 2 boys and they're very, very different. So when I say individual child's needs, many of you probably have the same thing. You may have more than one child and they have very different needs. And it's important to be able to meet their needs. And we're not just talking academically. You know, our 2 sons have different academic needs, social, emotional, and behavioral needs. And it's important to keep those things in mind. And again, as you're learning at home in this situation, you have so much more flexibility. So that's actually really beneficial. And not only thinking about your child's individual needs in the environment, but you have to think a bit about what are your capabilities, right? What are your abilities? What is your temperament like? I know I've talked to different family members and friends, and they're like, oh, I could never homeschool. You know, my personality, I could never teach this. You know, you have to take all of those things into account when you're deciding what's going to be best. And, you know, for me, I've got a son who's farther ahead now than I would be able to teach him in many areas. So we figured out some different ways to be able to work around that. So keeping in mind your own, you know, the environment, your individual child, and your own abilities and resources is really important. Another thing that is, especially when the pandemic first hit and kids were at home, excuse me, parents came to me. This was when I was a school psychologist too. Parents would always come, how do I get my kids to do work? Motivation always can be, and especially, you know, as you get into middle school, teenage years and everything, motivation, motivation, motivation. What can I do? How can I make them do the work? And, you know, what does it really mean to be motivated, to get them to want to do something? And we can think about motivation. We know a lot about it within the field of psychology. We can look to that literature, and it really is beneficial when we think about at-home learning to understand the differences between what we consider intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. And I'm going to talk a little bit, and it might sound a little bit negative about extrinsic motivation, and I hope it doesn't come across that way, because sometimes we need to do that. But we need to realize that when people do things to get a reward, to avoid punishment, you know, and sometimes we have to encourage our kids with those means. But the problem with that is when we over rely on extrinsic motivators, we can actually undermine the long-term love of learning, and it can have a really negative impact on things like creativity. So we have to be really careful of that. And what we really want to foster is that intrinsic motivation, that love of learning. You know, you want your kids to be seeking out novelty and challenging, wanting to do the work because they want to learn, right? They want to seek out that knowledge. And especially with gifted kids, sometimes there's some of this innate, like, just drive and desire to learn, right? So you don't want to squash that out, diminish that by over relying on sort of extrinsic reinforcers. Next. So how do we do that? That sounds great. Intrinsic motivation. Of course, that's a goal. We all want to be intrinsically motivated, right? But what are the conditions that we can create within our home environment to sort of increase that intrinsic motivation? And there's actually a lot of research, and it's not really rocket science. Some things that we can probably think about for ourselves, which make us intrinsically motivated, also work for our children. You know, having a sense of competency. We want to gain new skills. Kids want to gain new skills. So something new that they have a challenge to master. That's an important component. The second component, I can't overemphasize how important it is with at-home learning, how important it is to give your kids a sense of autonomy. And that can be hard depending on what option you're going to with schooling and what requirements are from the school and that kind of thing. But giving them some sort of choices and letting them know that they do have some control and they are sort of the captains of their own ships. And, you know, it might be that you give them different options, what they can do first or when they can do things, and or, you know, where they can put more of their focus. But giving kids choice can actually really increase their motivation. And then the last component of what's called the self-determination theory, which is a really well-researched theory that's been around since I think the early 1980s or late 1970s, is this concept of relatedness, right? Having an adequate, really good attachment relationship with your kids and letting them know that you're there for them. That is really, really important too in terms of increasing intrinsic things together. If you do those three things, that will sort of foster this high quality engagement and encourage that intrinsic motivation. So next. So you may have decided, okay, I might try this. I might try homeschooling and kind of break away a little bit from the typical schooling environment. What should I do now, right? What am I going to do? Well, there are tons of options, and these are just some of the options that are actually available, and I'm not going to talk about them in detail, but I did link to this really interesting, great website that's a wonderful resource, and it's a really fun quiz that you can take, and it's not a psychometrically validated instrument or anything like that, but it's a really, I actually really enjoyed it as someone who's been homeschooling for 5 years. I took it, and it made me think more about what is it that's important to me that in terms of learning, and it helped me kind of, you know, reevaluate what I was thinking about. And then it comes up and it shows you kind of where you fit in terms of homeschooling, and gives you more information about it. And you can read about all these different types on this particular website. And there are other resources as well to find out more about them. But I'm just going to mention, like, the first option is just basically what it sounds like, schooling at home. Some people, and I probably started off as a homeschooler more like that, taking what I thought was typical school and just bringing it at home and setting it up in sort of a really scheduled sort of way. But we've sort of evolved over time, and we're definitely more in the relaxed, eclectic model at this point. And there are different things. You might be hearing buzzwords about unschooling is really popular right now, and lots of people are having success in that area. There's a wonderful book by Carrie McDonald if you're really interested in the topic of unschooling, and then all the other ones down there. I recommend if you're looking into homeschooling, you look at all the different options available before you dive right in to figure out what you're going to do. Next. So first rule of homeschooling, and this is where I failed. I got frustrated. I wasn't ready to pivot. I decided I was going to make all these color-coded schedules and make it look exactly like school at home, and it didn't work out, and I got a little frustrated with everything. And I learned pretty quickly that I needed to be flexible. I needed to pivot, especially with our younger 2E child. I need to pivot a lot. I need to continually pivot to meet his needs as best as I can. And so just remembering that flexibility is so key. And as a school psychologist, I spent a lot of time in schools and I saw lots of wonderful instruction, but I think sometimes parents worry because your kids are away at school from 8 to 2 or 8 to 3, but a lot of that time isn't actual direct instructional time. So when you're at home, you can really reduce the amount of time that you're being concerned about actual instruction, if that's something that you're worried about. I like to think about how I feel that I'm being successful as a homeschooling parent is just helping a love of learning. Of course, but if your kids are enjoying learning at home, you should be feeling successful. And it's also important to keep in mind with siblings having different needs, that you might have to be more flexible in terms of scheduling and technology and outsourcing in different ways. And in some cases in our house, our kids are 3 years apart and very different, and our older son often is able to actually assist and help and step in and teach our younger son every once in a while sometimes. Next. So as Ellen said, this is so very, very important. Homeschooling by state is very, very different. And this is a really good resource from the Homeschool Legal Defense Association that you can go and just literally click on your state and gain so much information about what is allowed in your state, and even links you to further information that you can look to. I'm just going to quickly tell you that we are a family in California, and you have all these options right here. We have decided as a family that we established our own private school, which sounds much more complicated than it is. It's basically filling out a form, a private school affidavit every year, and keeping attendance and basically writing down the different areas that you're teaching your child. Nobody really checks it or anything, but you're supposed to keep those records along with health records. And then there are some other options as well within California that you can see up there. The issue is, it varies greatly. And you can see if you look, this is kind of small on here, but if you look at some states have very low or no regulation, and some states have very, very high regulation. So that's something to keep in mind if you're considering homeschooling in the future. So next. So social life and friends. This is something that people are very concerned about when they first start homeschooling, but once you dive in, you realize there are so many opportunities. Now, of course, that's not in the pandemic times where the social opportunities are a lot less, but even during the pandemic times, we can still figure out ways to have some socialization happening. It might be more virtual, but you want to make sure if you decide to take on homeschooling that you are getting your kids opportunities to participate in things, field trips, play dates, even finding online interest groups. Specialized live online classes. I know, especially my older son, he's taken a ton of live online classes through different vendors, and he's connected with kids who they all take the same classes. And he's like, oh, I know such and such, and they have like a social aspect to the class and stuff like that. And that's really cool for him. Also, of course, group lessons in sports, but again, right now during COVID, some of those are canceled. And we've also, as a family, done stuff like have game nights, and you could translate those into online game nights or Lego days. We translated, having Zoom meetings where our kids just were like talking to other kids about the Lego sets they built and stuff like that. And that was so much fun. So there are a lot of choices even during pandemic time to make sure you can have your kids with other kids. So really, I'll try to go over this really quickly, sort of a day in the life, because I've kind of talked about some big ideas in terms of homeschooling and psychology. But what does it look like? That's what a lot of people want to know. So we have two, like I said, very different boys. And we have a 13-year-old who is sort of in that PG sort of range. And he is, at this point, although a few years ago I was much more hands-on with him, right now on a day-to-day basis, his schedule is more like a college student. He decided on what classes he wants to take through what vendors he likes a lot, and he picked them on his own. You know, he's going to be taking AP Calculus, Physics, Advanced World History, and Shakespearean Literature. And those are all his 4 live online classes where he has to meet once a week for like an hour. You know, they have assignments, some of them have tests, some of them are graded, some of them are ungraded. And he meets live online and can connect with other students. Then he does other stuff with myself, and I should say my husband too, because we kind of made this a family homeschooling. And he also, an interesting thing for him as a gifted student has been that he is teaching his own classes through Athena's Advanced Academy, where he previously took classes that he loved. He is now teaching classes there to younger gifted students, because Athena's is a wonderful resource. If you haven't heard of Athena's Advanced Academy, live online classes for gifted students. And he's teaching history classes. He has his first French monarchs history class to teach tomorrow. And last year he taught British monarchs through history and American presidents. And I also want to say that I know that sometimes it's really hard to navigate. And I think we put together a really great resource list, but like things like online G3 and Art of Problem Solving are some great courses that are really targeted towards gifted students in live online learning. And then other resources, you can see those below. Now for our 2E son, who's extraordinarily different, we do many more asynchronous things when we do them online, but we also just give him tons of freedom to play and create. Lots of supplemental activities with all of our family, and just trying to connect with some of those additional resources as well. Next. So what are the costs for homeschooling? Well, it can be free. It can be free to lots and lots of money, depending on if you go to a fully online school. But there are lots of resources, whether or not they're online or you use your public library. The public library has so many different options. And of course, individual kind of tutoring classes versus group classes can vary a lot in price. And as Ellen was saying, synchronous versus asynchronous, usually synchronous live online classes are going to be a little bit more expensive. And fully online schools would probably be the most expensive option, where you're basically kind of handing over everything to someone else to take care of. So in terms of what are the benefits for gifted learners, they can be many. And this is why, while this is like a really difficult time, homeschooling can have and remote learning in general can be very beneficial to gifted learners who have really different needs. You can accelerate the pace, you can accommodate that asynchronicity. You can deep dive. That is like the greatest thing. You can deep dive, let your kids deep dive into the areas that really interest them. They'll have more time probably. Our son created a website and he's a junior instructor at Athena's Advanced Academy. And in high school, kids can take dual enroll in college classes, find peers beyond, regular age mates. And one really great thing is there's just more time with family. For 2E learners, and I told you our younger son definitely falls into this category. And I think when we think about this, we really need to be considering what is the exceptionality, because of course that matters greatly. And in terms of what I've found to work the best is to really focus on strengths, this strengths-based approach, cultivate whatever their areas of strengths are. It can be really tempting to over-focus on the weaker areas, and you definitely want to address those. But if you over focus on trying to bring those up to speed right away, especially, you can run into a lot of issues in terms of the relationship, and you want to make sure that that is the most important thing, the relationship that you have with your child. Some of the things that have worked for our family are just shorter lessons, letting him take a lot of breaks, go outside a lot, figuring out what time of the day, he needs to get done kind of earlier in the morning. And just adapting to his unique learning needs is really important. And, just simple things, like he really likes a daily checklist, like creating things in a simple notebook. Each day we kind of work together and make a little checklist, and he checks things off and he's done. And just little simple things have really helped our younger son be successful in the homeschooling environment. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica Kohler. My name is Jessica LaFollette, and I'm going to be taking the next section about getting started. And I want to congratulate and thank all of you for even being here on this webinar tonight. You've already gotten started. You've already been exploring the resources and thinking about what's really best for the gifted people in your life. So as I talk through this, I kind of want to acknowledge that homeschooling is one awesome possibility, but there are also lots of other possibilities out there, and everything's really going to be determined by what is best for your family. So our first step here is laying the foundation, and each of our panelists have mentioned this briefly already, but you want to conduct a family needs assessment. That really is starting to think specifically about what our family needs and what each individual child within our family needs. And of course, we could conduct one of these in normal times, and it's going to look very different than the COVID-19 family needs assessment. We want to consider the gifted academic needs of our children, but also the social emotional needs, and of course right now physical needs related to safety or even related to the location where they can be have adequate childcare. That might even be more important than normal right now. We also want to consider what equity issues are important to us. My research background is really related to equity, and I think a lot of us have been thinking about social justice more clearly this summer than we had in the past, and that's something I'm going to get to at the end, but that should be part of the needs assessment, part of thinking about what's happening around us in our community. You also want to consider some realism. What can we realistically provide based on the schedules of our family demands and the COVID situation that we can't escape on our own. And then finally, all those needs assessment priorities need to be clearly communicated with family members. That means sitting down and talking with your kids about what is important to them, and then talking to them about what is important to you as a parent. Okay, next slide, step number 2. Investigating requirements. Again, most of you have already begun that journey just by coming to this webinar tonight, and probably people have already started to look into this, but please, please, I can't overstate that you need to know the rules and what is going to be acceptable to your state Department of Education. If you are sticking with a public school providing a remote or hybrid option through your local district, you can know that that is accredited almost everywhere. The local districts are accredited by the state. So you can take that as your baseline and then add to it. If you are going to go outside of the local school district and you're sticking with an established private or virtual online program, you can be pretty well guaranteed that those things are also accredited and they've been established. If you're going to do something new that hasn't necessarily been done by you or by someone else in your community that you know of, you're really going to need to check the regulations. And again, Dr. Kohler already provided you that homeschool link for checking your particular state. I would also encourage you to check with your state's regulations about gifted education and twice exceptional learners. And that link to NAGC is an excellent one that will give you the contact information for the state department's gifted education office in your state. And as you're thinking about the needs of your gifted child, as well as your twice exceptional child, and you really want to access some local expertise, your state organization for the gifted is going to be a great place to find people who know the rules and what works for gifted students who are homeschooled, what works for gifted students who are in a fully online virtual program that might not even be located in your state. I highly recommend people to contact those state organizations. Those are your local experts. Next slide. Some questions to ask as you're considering homeschooling or something that looks a little bit like homeschooling, or even as you're stuck in a remote option, not through the district, but with your kids at home. You want to be careful to ask, are the gifted services provided even if my student is at home? And this does vary a little bit state to state. If you're lucky enough to live in a place that already has gifted services and your child is participating in a gifted program while they're at school, chances are that program is going to continue through the district. It might look a little different, like everything looks different. But if you're not in a place that already has a gifted program, it's going to be just a few more questions to ask and a little bit more digging to do. You also want to think about what options are available to people who are not enrolled in the district. If you choose to do homeschooling, sometimes the local district might still provide opportunities to participate in a standardized test. They might allow you to participate in athletics or academic competitions, even though we know, sadly, a lot of those are limited right now. But especially for our 2E learners, depending on the exceptionality, if your child had an IEP last year or they currently have accommodations, IDEA, the federal law about special education has not changed. They are still entitled to those accommodations and to those special education services, even if the school is going remote. A lot of school districts are working very hard on trying to figure out how to provide those in a way that's safe, but also meets the needs of these kids. And I know different districts are all over the place right now, but don't hesitate to continue to ask for those services and to get clarification on where those are going to come from, because that's really important. And if you decide to use a homeschooling option or go outside the district for a year or whatever semester at a time, be sure to record any accommodations that you're providing for your students' exceptionality at home. Document those so that when or if you do return to a normal school district, you will have an explanation of how those accommodations continue to be provided. Again, I want to encourage people to, oh, sorry, can you go back one? I just want to make sure people contact their state departments. NAGC and all of us panelists, we're trying to provide the best advice we can, but local homeschooling networks, other people who have been doing homeschooling or who are forming pods and have looked into the legal advice might be able to help you, but make sure that you check your state Department of Education. Okay, next. Here's our step 3, and there's only 4, but step 3, again, you're already doing this by exploring resources that are available. And one of the best parts of this particular webinar is that you will get a very long, very extensive list of resources for gifted learners. The panelists tonight, as well as the entire board of the Parent Editorial Advisory Board for NAGC, has compiled this list, and you will receive a PDF of all of these with links. And that will give you some answers. I've noticed in the chat people popping up questions about, well, if I'm in my local district, but I also want to supplement with some other things, where can I get those? If I want to go to a national virtual school for gifted children, how do I find those? All of those excellent answers are on our resource list. You also might want to do a little digging into what the standards are in your state and about the types of opportunities available for gifted learners and the strategies that work for them, especially if you are going to be taking a bigger role at home in providing the academic environment for your gifted child. You might want to know a little bit about what compacting and acceleration really mean. Okay, next slide. This is one of my favorite slides I really wanted to talk about, because I want people to know that you do not have to view the district as an adversary, even if you are pretty sure that what they are providing is not going to meet all the needs of your gifted child. Working with the district is always going to help in the long run. Just if anything, you might be able to just access the local gifted expertise. There are gifted experts spread out around the country who know what the local rules are, and they also have training in gifted education. So that local expertise is going to be really important, and continuing to access that through a local district is probably the easiest way to get to it. I also want to kind of think about all of the free options before deciding on something that might cost your family a lot of money. And as a public school employee and as a mom, I have noticed already in the last few weeks that teachers have been ramping up and administration has been ramping up, and we all need to expect that the remote learning we saw last spring, as both of the previous panelists mentioned, they will not, it won't look the same. You can expect that it will be more rigorous this fall and designed to be online if your school is going online. Finally, I want to make sure that people think about credit upon return, especially in a high school situation where you're looking toward graduation, college entrance, et cetera. You want to be careful that what work your students do while they're at home will be accepted as credit moving forward. And finally, advocating, even if the school district isn't able to meet your gifted child's needs, the fact that you have brought those needs to the district's attention benefits all gifted learners in your local area. So advocating for your child's needs is really advocating for more than just your child. Next slide. All right, our fourth and final step here is to craft a learning plan. This is the part where a lot of people felt like they were stuck because they just really didn't know very much about what all the options are. And many of us still might feel like we're stuck. But if you have taken the time to do a family needs assessment, thought about what your kids really need, what your family really needs, look at the state requirements, and also think about all the available resources to you, then considering the costs and benefits of each option becomes something like making a pros and cons list. And then as you create this plan, you've got to be flexible. Just like what Dr. Kohler said, you're probably going to have to pivot. You're probably going to have to change things up as you go along, and expect that if you're working with the district, the teachers in the districts are also going to have to be flexible and pivot for our in-person learning, our hybrid learning, and our full remote learning. Those things are going to change throughout the year as the pandemic progresses one way or the other within our local areas. And finally, the fourth step is create a backup plan. Have your plan B kind of ready to go, because there's a good chance you might need it as things change or as you look at what's working for your kids or what's not working. Next slide. This is the part I really wanted to make sure I spend some time on before we get to the end of the session tonight. Most learning options are not equitably available to all. Unfortunately, the chance to homeschool or to send your child to a dream private school that is completely for gifted children is not an option for most parents, maybe we'll even say a majority of people. So keep in mind that if you do have those options, your voice and your expertise might be helpful to other people. As we know, based on the data about our country right now, a majority, about 51% of our students in public school qualify for free or reduced lunch. And those students have a whole lot of different concerns going on right now. So on the next slide, I'd like to present a few things about equity. As you look closely at your family's privilege, I want to encourage people to discuss equity with the gifted child. You are the expert in your child. You know what an age-appropriate discussion could look like. And we also know that gifted children are very concerned about justice-related issues, and they have a keen sense of fairness and equity. So discussing those things can be one of the most beneficial times as your family creates this plan. Talk about equity with your neighbors, equity within your community, or equity within the school that you're trying to create or the pod environment that you might be working on. And if you do have expertise or the ability to advocate somehow, consider that you are magnifying the impact of time and expertise by including other gifted children in your advocacy efforts, in your virtual learning times, any communities that you might create. That advocacy benefits everyone. I know one of the things that NAGC has been working really hard is to get people in our country to see gifted children, or people within the world to know that gifted children exist. They are out there. They look like every part of our population, and they all have different but very special needs. So I just want to encourage people, as you're thinking about what works for your kid, you might also think about, wow, you know, this really could benefit a lot of other kids. Is there a community organization that's already doing that kind of work that I can get involved in? Or is there a community organization that doesn't know about gifted learners that would really benefit from the voice of my family? Next slide. Thank you.
You're not disappointed, are you? Weren't those great ideas? Maybe feeling a little overwhelmed right now with so much that you have going on. I would like to take this time, though, to focus on some of your questions. You've turned in great questions, and we're not going to have time for all of them, but please realize we will try to address everything that you've sent. So the first one I want to ask, if your gifted child is not receiving work to their ability in a remote learning situation, panelist, how do you recommend advocating with the teacher school to provide more challenging work? You know, they're overloaded. So what's the best way to proceed?
Can I take that one?
Oh, please do.
I would just start with thinking about who your child's favorite teacher has been in the past. And, you know, if they're in kindergarten, maybe they haven't had a lot of chance with that. But I would think about what was it about that particular classroom environment that really sparked their imagination, that got them excited about learning, and then take that little piece of, hey, I loved this about school, or my child really loved this, and go into your district or talk to your teacher this year with, start with a positive thing, like, my child loves to learn in this way. How can we have more of this? Instead of pointing out all of the ways that don't work for your child, because we know there's going to be, those will come, but start with thinking about what really does get them excited.
And I think that positive approach works well. Ellen, would you like to add to that?
I do want to add to that. I think it's also important to recognize that online learning and remote learning isn't sitting in front of your computer 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. And so really what you want to do is let them know how quickly your student is finishing their work, and that they're maybe not as engaged, and see if the teacher or the GT teacher at the school is willing or able to provide alternative options. And then also, depending on your school district, you might be able to look at the district website or the state affiliation in terms of additional resources for providing that additional option. And I mean, it's really about finding your child's interests and encouraging your child to thrive in the love of learning.
Definitely. Another question. Is there a good way to pod for remote learning with the school such that gifted kids can remain motivated without their parents on hand? Ellen?
So our district is looking at a variety of options, and they're not advocating pods, and they're trying to figure out how for children to get together. So if you're in a remote environment, talk to your district. If you have opted for the fully online version of public school this year, or whatever school you're in and it's a fully online version of that, talk to them about clustering the students together. If they're going back in a remote setting, again, or in a hybrid remote start or whatever that is, talk about how they can be grouped together in a way that maybe is a little bit more inclusive so that the gifted students are together, or talk about or ask questions about how they're planning on meeting those needs. And it may be that the remote options are providing more opportunities to meet with gifted students across school buildings that they wouldn't have had in a concrete classroom. And so I think it's really important to talk with that, and then also recognize that districts are often site-based, again, depending on your school and your district. So what one school is doing may or may not necessarily be what another school is doing in your same district.
I think you're right on that. And you know, one thing that I've heard multiple times from panelists is don't be afraid to work with the schools. You know, we all want what's best for your children, whether you're an administrator, a parent, a teacher, it's also important. This is a question that's going to be a quick one, but Dr. LaFollette, you mentioned home assessment, and they would be really happy if you could provide some sort of template with that. Well, folks, we're not going to cover all of the slides, or we can do them kind of fast, but there are, I don't know, 12 different slides here that is just resource after resource after resource. And so many of your questions, whether that's in the chat or the Q&A, you're asking for, you know, what's the best resource for a high school for doing online, or I've got a preschooler, what can I do with them? I've got a hybrid model. So I think you're going to be super happy when you look through all of these resources. Some focus just on COVID-19, the grief that comes along with kids as they step away from their regular schooling. I mean, there are just so many rich, wonderful resources out there. Don't forget that NAGC is the place for you to come to find answers to your questions. And if we don't have answers, we'll do our very best to figure out what those might be. If you're not a member, I certainly hope that you will join. Numbers count greatly. And as our panelists have talked, it's very important that we come as a united front when we come to our legislators to ask for more funding, and that's really important. As you can see here, we've got homeschooling resources, and if you just flip on through Dr. Honeck, there are many others that different, like Gifted New York State shared with us some resources. So you've got ideas for enrichment as well. I want to thank you again for your attention this evening, for all of your questions. I do hope that we will be able to answer those after this is over with. But please know that this has all been recorded, that next week you will get information regarding how you can access this on YouTube. You will get a PDF of the presentation, and you will also have a resource that is just for you folks who are with us tonight, and it's called Alternate Education Option Resources for Parents, and that's hot off the press from NAGC. Once again, thank you so much for joining us.